Hello, and welcome to the Responsive Family Sleep Podcast. I'm your host, Kim Hawley, holistic sleep coach, lactation consultant, peaceful parenting educator, and mom. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by all the conflicting sleep info, frustrated with sleep information that just plain felt wrong, or search desperately for a truly gentle and responsive sleep approach, then you are in the right place. In each episode, we'll be answering your most pressing baby and toddler sleep questions, busting those sleep myths, and helping you understand truly developmental, biologically normal baby and toddler sleep, plus encouraging you to trust your intuition along the way. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to the podcast. I am very excited about this week's episode. I've actually had it on my list for a while, and finally, here we are. We're going to talk about dads with an expert on dads. Would you call yourself an expert on dads? I don't know. My husband always wants to be on the podcast, and I tell him he can't be on the podcast because he doesn't have the right vibe.
Oh, that's
And so
hysterical.
I told him I was
What's
having
that
a real
vibe?
dad expert on the
Oh
podcast.
no. Okay.
And
Well,
he thought it
hopefully I
was
have the
funny.
vibe.
Anyway,
Am I an expert? I don't know. Who's an expert? If you think you're an expert,
fair.
you're probably off.
Fair,
So
but we
no, I
have,
have enough confidence in what I'm doing. Let's put it that
yes, a
way.
knowledgeable
There you go.
therapist who does a lot of work with dads, Adam Angel, on today. So, Adam, why don't you share a little bit about your work? And thank you so much for joining us.
Sure. I come at this through like a previous work, doing, sort of the social worker, nonprofit world, 15 years or so. And then COVID hit, and I'll give like basically the rundown is I had my second 10 days after we went home for COVID. 6 months later, with my son and my daughter who's the older one, we were like, out of our leave, and I left my
Yes.
job and I went private practice. And as I was doing that, I was kind of like floating out things to colleagues in the area. I'm like, hey, is there anything for dads? Anything for dads? And sort of happened really, truly organically. I think like we all want things to happen organically, but then like you like don't actually know how that really works, and that's the whole
Hmm.
point. So this kind of happened, and there were some fits and starts, and I had a lot of responses from other professionals and a lot of moms, but nothing from fathers. I'm like, oh, I need to do something different. So I went, made my own website, and then got in touch with the Breastfeeding Center of Greater Washington, and that's how we started. Started with the New Dads group. So I had, my somewhat newborn and 3-year-old who was really struggling through the COVID and along with us.
Along with everybody.
And, and I was like, I know what I'm doing. Because look at it, I mean, I actually didn't think that I knew what I was doing, but I was like, at least I knew that I was going through it with them, which I think
Mhm.
was really helpful. And I look back at that now, and probably the biggest thing is that I have that I didn't have that might give me the expert thing is that one, I went through it, but also that, it's just the confidence that I don't have to know everything, and just being present with the guys that I'm working with, and like there doesn't need to be an answer for everything, but there is support. And so we have a new dad support group, which is 10 weeks long, and does one topic. It's semi-structured, so that means like we have stuff to share and information, but there's also a lot of space. And the more space I made of myself, quote unquote, it's such a therapist thing to say, the more there was space for the guys. And like that was the new dads group. And then there is the therapy group, which I didn't expect to gain traction, which I call Dads 2.0, and it's basically group for dads with any age children. It tends to be filled with dads with 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 year olds because the challenges of that. And so a lot of
Those are
them are just
challenging.
having one new, maybe they're having like a second child or whatever it is. So we meet also weekly, but that's ongoing. Guys will try it out for a couple months, and then they'll realize they like it, stay. Have about 5 guys in those, have a couple of those a week as well. So it's going well, and I love those guys. I love those groups. They're great. And of course, I meet with Dads 101. Yeah, and I didn't say this earlier, but just to make sure that there's space for everyone. I have dads that are also have groups for dads that have lost in childbirth, specifically in stillbirth and early
Mhm.
infancy, and that's something that me and my wife went through before our oldest living child. So that's also something I want to make sure there's space for people. They know about that too.
I don't think I knew that about you. Our second was stillborn, so
Oh, well,
yeah.
that's I didn't know that. Thank you for
Yeah.
sharing that.
There was not a lot of resources for my husband
No.
at the time, and he was forced to go back to work 2 weeks later. So that was an
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah. It's yeah. That's
Um,
sorry to hear that.
yeah. So I'm glad. I'm glad you're building that resource. It's very, very needed. Dad. I feel like there's so much talk about moms, and dads are part of it, right? Such an important part of it. And like having that space for them to process their own experience, their own identity shifts, and then how those intersect with their partners. That's huge, right? I see so many ways we kind of have these dynamics between parents play out when it comes to sleep. And I want to get into those, but I just want to know, like, when you think about some of the key themes as it might relate to like the baby and the toddler kind of sleep years, the sleep journey, the sleep negotiation, the all of
Mm.
that. What is like one of the things that you feel like comes up a lot for the dads when you're chatting with
It
them
might
in any
be,
of the groups?
yeah, it might be helpful, like thinking about it from a sort of process of the time. Thinking about like, even in pregnancy, you have just different experience and expectations from the partner, like the non-birthing partner, et cetera.
Yeah.
And so if dads are like thinking about, sort of what they're experiencing, how real is the pregnancy, that's a big part of, you know, getting, ready in the mindset. And so everyone has like different rituals and stuff like that. But when I do I do like 1 hour free workshop that I do for like dads going into to the birth itself. And so like I started out kind of thinking about like what is it that's coming up for them, and just kind of like trying to land more and more that like this is happening, and then like how to prepare for the birth, and like so much of this oriented towards to go to the themes is protection and providing and
Mhm.
support. Like how do I be that rock for my partner,
Mhm.
which we know is this is like some of the classic masculinity, which again, like we're embracing this and speaking about it from a healthy standpoint. So I always say like the rock is built on a boulder. You can be a rock for your family, but the boulder below it is the group of men, right? So it's like the other men and of course others that are supporting you. There is historically always support for men in many communities. And it's like, okay, we have to make sure that this exists for us. So,
Yeah.
part of that is like, okay, so we have these moments, for example, like where we don't have as much capacity because of our sleep. I mean, I always, one of the first things I say is like, how's your sleep? And I'm sure you say the same thing, especially in your work, but it's like, we can't get anywhere unless we know where you are in that, because this is a form of torture to not get
Mhm.
sleep. And this is what's happening in the first few months. And even in the period of pregnancy, if your partner is suffering, well, you're suffering too. Um, in one way or the other, you're putting this pressure on yourself, and maybe rightfully so. There needs to be something done here. You have to do a lot to ask and be asked, but we have to also be able to ask and look outward to the community for that support. Otherwise, you have these problems of isolation.
Yeah.
Um, so that's where I'll start in terms of the theme. So a lot of dads will go into this being like, I'm already like thinking like I need to get my own sleep, I need to get my life back on track, and at the same time, I have to support my partner. I want to make sure they're okay. And there's a spectrum. Like there's men that walk in saying, I want to do everything different than my father. I want to do everything different than what I've been taught or what's out
Mm.
there. I want to be, present dad. I want to be supportive. I want to make sure breastfeeding is going well. And there's maybe men that are sort of more in the sort of like not as aware in that area, and like are trying to get more aware around that, but are still not really fully taking on all of the labor that they could. And so like, part of this group is supporting maybe people where they go too much and don't take care of themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that you see a little bit more with the moms.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of dads doing that. But then there's also a number of dads who are like, oh, you know, maybe I need to pull my weight a little more over here. But I think which we'll get to is like what's most useful is like, you know, thinking about how this is collectively done between the partner, you know, the two parents,
Yes.
and thinking about like, you know, what's the balance so that we can support ourselves, support our relationships, support our marital relationship or partnership, and of course the baby. You know,
Yeah,
so
absolutely. And I like to talk about, how are we working together as a team, and that isn't always going to look like what we imagined it to look like, right? So I'll have parents that come to me, and this is a big theme with a lot of the families I support, where we have a really strong mom preference, either just holistically all around or just around sleep, right?
mhm,
They're great with dad at any other time, but
mhm, mhm,
not around sleep. And,
mhm,
more so with nursing babies, but, certainly I see it with bottle fed babies too. It's not just a nursing baby thing. But I think when we have nursing babies, that's like one tool that dad doesn't have. So
mhm,
I see a
mhm.
lot of dads feel like they're at a disadvantage. But it's like, okay, they come to me like, we want sleep to be like totally even. And the baby's like, ha ha ha, no way, no how. Um, and so
Huh?
it's like, okay, well, we can work on that in the long term,
Mm,
but that might not be our best use of energy in the short term. But that
right.
also doesn't mean that we're stuck in the status quo, right? Because what we have is really unequitable effort for
Mhm,
this family. And there's so many other ways that we can be helpful to each other
mhm,
besides
mhm.
exactly splitting sleep duties. If
Right.
that's not working, right? Like if that's not working very well right now, then let's put that energy into something else.
It's such a balance. I'm not cutting you off here too. I'm just
No, go
thinking
ahead.
like it's also important that we don't give in to what's initially the preference. So it's like
Hmm.
I'm with you. I definitely there's a lot of ways
Yes.
to help, but if we give up, we create the cycle more
Yes.
deep in the cycle. So
Yes.
it is really much an intuition thing that we have to support our clients. And if you're not a therapist, then you have to think about for yourself. It's like, okay, we have been trying this. I did not just give up. I am working through this. I'm trying to take on more time, trying to go a little longer, trying to make sure that my child is actually getting used to me and has a chance to really truly sort of balance out the preference. And at the same
Hmm.
time, like maybe not today, maybe not this week, maybe not this month. And it's like, okay, well, what does that mean? That means actually you need to, this is a big thing. Like, am I giving up on my family by sleeping in another room? That's an important one. It's like, actually, no, you're doing the opposite. You're really actually supporting your mental health, which supports your family's mental health. And it's like, you just got to keep talking about it. It's tough. And it's tough to talk about all this stuff because so much blame happens when you haven't slept at all. And so it's like, okay, go sleep. You figure out the cycle and you say, okay, I'm going to get up early and I'm going to be the early shift. And
Hmm.
and then just like kind of supporting that intuition of the family, which is obviously the combination and discussion between the two.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And I work with I love two things that you said. I want to try to hold on to two of them to respond to, but I work with a lot of families that have like really highly sensitive kiddos.
Mm,
And so sometimes it really like this is not the thing to persist on right now.
mhm,
And so just all the different ways that you can share the load that aren't sleep, right? While we give baby a little bit more time to be in a better place. Like we're not giving it on it forever. We're just saying, okay, we're really hitting a brick wall here. Is this
mhm,
worth continuing the effort it's taking? Or would it be helpful to try some other strategies to shift some of the parenting load or household load or other things? And it depends on the family, right? What the answer is there. But I
mhm,
love what you're saying about like kind of bailing if it's hard, right? Kind of deepening
mhm,
that, because I see that a lot too, where it's like, okay, we're gonna have dad settle off the first week, right? And
Mhm.
it's like as soon as baby starts crying, everyone's like, "Oh, it's not working." It's like,
Mhm.
okay, calm down. Right? Like
Mhm. Mhm.
this
Well,
baby is
which,
crying with their dad. They're not on their own.
hmm,
And
hmm,
like we can give this a little space and we can keep trying. Like we don't have to give up just because baby's not like, oh, this is the best idea, guys. This is so wonderful. I'm so happy you changed my pattern and now daddy's coming in to settle me at this wake. Like,
yeah.
we can keep persisting, like you were saying, until something says, actually, we're not getting any traction here. And that is very much, I think, an intuition thing and a knowing your kid thing. And
There's
where is it worth putting energy right now, and that right now isn't forever. And that we can work on parent preference away from sleep if it is beyond sleep that we're seeing it. We don't always have to work on it, sleep. And I generally don't start with sleep, actually. If we're seeing it in other ways, or if that dad and baby don't have a lot of time together without mom around or without their partner around, then I don't even start with sleep. We work towards sleep. So it's hard because there's like so much biology there, and yet we also like there's so
well,
much
there's also
creativity.
something coming up around usually about like I'm not good enough, right? Like I think like
Mhm.
this is probably the core of much of what we feel. I mean, we've gutted a lot of the cultural passing and support
Yes.
of parents, and we're asking parents to be intuitive. Like looking at your name of your podcast, of course, and your business. And it's like the reality is that like intuition comes from support of generations. And we've said, we're saying to a lot of our parents, like, hey, like you don't know what you're doing. And it's like on some level,
Mhm.
that's probably accurate. And there's also maybe that's been already interrupted in some previous generation too. And there's just like a lot of disconnection. And so it's
Yeah.
like, okay, so what we're calling intuition used to be intuitive because people were really connected to babies from an early age. There was a process,
Mhm.
there was a system, for better or worse. That is a really, just in itself, really useful. And so
Yeah.
not having that and saying, okay, like look to the internet, look to Adam and Kim, maybe they know what they're talking about. It's like, what we're trying to reflect back is like, okay, some of this, yes, is research, education, new ideas, it's great. But it's also like, there is something here internally, and we're trying to help people uncover that. And one of the things that comes up is, oh, like they're crying. I'm a bad parent. I don't know what I'm doing because they don't know what they're doing. They haven't had a lot of experience. I'll speak for a lot of
Mhm.
fathers. Here it's like, how much time have we spent with newborns? Basically none. The average man has basically spent none. And I'm not going to pretend to know what that is, how much that's true for others, but the reality is that in my experience, I didn't have much, and I felt like I was like generally a very emotionally open person. I liked kids and stuff like that, but I was like, I had a mindset even for my first baby. Like, I know what I'm gonna do once they're X age, X years. But before that, I'm like looking for other people's leadership.
Mhm.
And it's like, okay, so now a baby's crying in my arms. I already feel like I might drop them. I don't know if I'm doing it right. And then they start to cry, and I'm like, oh gosh, now I'm going to give them back to the person that I think can resolve it because there is a connection, like you said,
Mhm.
of biology and, of course, breastfeeding, as even more of that. So
Yep.
it's quite hard to, it's like just having the empathy and compassion for them, but also for support them and having that for themselves and for each
Yep.
other. Like you said, I liked how you said that. It was like, the baby's going to be a little frustrated in that moment, maybe because they're not getting exactly what they've already received. I always call like the all inclusive that they used to have in womb. Inherently, the fourth trimester,
So true.
this first 3 month period is a huge adjustment and it's a huge
Yes.
loss for the baby. So we have to be like, okay, we're being attentive because they had an all inclusive and now they have to pay to play. It's like they got to go in, they got to get what they get, and it's like you're offering.
I
Okay,
love
well, I'm
that.
offering this over here, and it's like that's not as good as what I've had. It's hard, but
Hmm.
we are being responsive, and I heard that in your point too. It's like dad is holding the baby. Baby isn't alone. They might be frustrated, but they're not alone. And the more the dad knows you're not alone, I'm not leaving my baby alone. This is actually enough.
Hmm.
what I'm doing is enough right now. Now, it may not be that the baby is ready yet for this, but we're going to work with this. We're going to stay with this. And that's the intuitive part that we're trying to support. And like, I am holding the baby and it's okay. And
Mhm.
if they're frustrated, and I'm okay too in the midst of their crying, which by the way is a very triggering thing. I think you know that cry. It's so hard, let alone in the middle of the night and you're tired. So I
Yeah.
appreciate what you were saying earlier.
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons when that's a big challenge for families. I start during the day. I'm like, how often is this baby hanging out with dad without
Mm-hmm.
mom to intervene when baby's upset? Assuming that we're talking about a newborn and like, we're not,
Mm-hmm.
we're past the newborn time where we're not going to mess with like the establishment of breastfeeding and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times I'll be like, oh, well, we hang a lot out as a family, but they're almost never on their own for more than like, 30 minutes or something. I'm like, well, what happens when you're together as a family and baby gets upset? Mom does the comforting. I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, well, like, let's start changing some of those patterns. Not all the time, but like, let's start giving them an opportunity for it. Like, daddy can comfort me. And I'm not always going to mom for comfort and daddy for play because I see that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And that way we can do it some when everyone is more cope, right? When they were during the day. And at least as adults, we are a little bit more reserves before we start asking an adult to stay regulated, when it's a hard time to stay regulated.
Yeah.
And then you get that confidence, right? And if you're more confident, if you're like, I got you, baby, like we're in this
Mm-hmm.
together, we're good. Then they're like, oh, your nervous system is telling me this is safe,
That's right.
right? And that's automatically going to make it easier, not
Mm-hmm.
easy, but easier
That's right.
than if you're like, oh, crud. Like, what am I doing? Oh, no, you just want to nurse. Let's go get you to mommy.
Yeah,
Or
and
mommy runs in and rescues and interrupts because, like, oh no, baby's crying.
right.
And then doesn't give you the space as a dad to figure it out. I also see a lot of that, of like, we got to give them space. We got to give them some space.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're probably gonna flow on that, and also some other things. I was just thinking also, there's so much around like responsiveness. I heard you say earlier, like just like what you're doing during the day, and like sometimes there are belief systems that are, I don't believe that I should respond right away because, which,
Mhm.
again, I want to be clear. I think you probably are in your other episodes, but just like I don't have an opinion of like this is the right way, but saying that like noticing that between the couple, if there's a big differential of the
Mhm.
responsiveness, obviously the person that was most responsive or first to respond will get the work. And so that's something that comes up in it's like a book that one of the guys in the New Dads group some time ago, like a couple of years ago, was like, yeah, this is a great book, and it talks about the responsiveness. The first one to respond gets the work, and that leads to so much more of the work in parenting. So just thinking about what does it mean to respond? How do you relate to that? And I think a lot of men will say, well, I want them to be resilient, and that needs to be sort of fleshed out with the partner,
Mhm.
because again, you can decide that, but you need to decide that together. Otherwise, you're going to have this discrepancy, and that's just going to lead to all the problems that we know come from that discrepancy and the
Yeah.
resentment between this parents. So, and there is a time and place for all of that, right? Like we want our kids to be resilient, but what does that mean? What does that look like? And
How do we unpack the cultural push for babies to be independent in a way that's not actually developmentally appropriate, right? Like, what does it mean to be resilient from what we know now about neuroscience and
Mhm.
attachment versus sort of the old kind of outdated idea that like not responding creates resilience when we're talking about really young kids here, right? Like I think there's a lot of unpacking in those belief systems that couples need to have. And sometimes it is values and small decisions. And sometimes it's like, no, we actually need to look at the science and make sure that we're not just making kind of cultural decisions that are out of step with what we know, especially if
Yeah,
there's disagreement, right? Like, and, where it's like, okay, but that's not actually how you build a resilient child is not by not responding to a baby. Too many knots there, but you know what I mean.
Yeah,
Um,
I do. And I hold this like neutral space, which we were talking about earlier, where it's like my number one is that you and your partner decide together like what this
mhm.
is, what we're going to do here. And it's like there's a lot of discrepancy and like it's hard to know all the things you won't agree on. But once you start to see, oh
It
well,
is.
that was my
Yeah.
expectation, we can either ignore it and pretend it's not happening and then all the things come from it, or we can say like, hey, like I feel like if we're ignoring this, this is actually going to be helpful, then they'll settle. And the other person says no, then there has to be what I think you're probably familiar with. I'm trying to think what the name of the book here is. Like fair play. You're probably familiar with fair play. And like one of the things that she talks about, and I kind of take that idea and bring it over here, is this idea of minimum standard of care, which is to say that like, we have to agree like, okay, this is the minimum. And no matter what, we're not going to give our kid any less responsiveness than this. And if
Mhm.
that is the case, that means that like, when this comes to this point with you and you're the one in charge, you're the one that should be responding 50% of the time, no matter what you have to do there. And I think once that's
Mhm.
established, or I like to call it the parenting umbrella, it's like we might have different styles, sort of specific, maybe methods, but within this umbrella, they're acceptable for both of us.
Yeah,
And so, yeah,
I
that
like that.
includes sleep and responsiveness.
And that takes so much communication, right? Open, like really hearing what your partner is saying and feeling willing to explore it to see where you guys agree and where those differences are. Um, I feel like a lot of times we don't necessarily have those skills well established before we become parents, like that level, because you really can't anticipate all the things
Mm-hmm.
that you're going to have to talk about and negotiate and potentially disagree on when it comes to parenting. Like, even if you try to talk about
Mm-hmm.
it before you have kids, like, you just
Yeah.
don't know how you're going to feel and
Mm-hmm.
all the different things until you're in it and you know what kind of baby you have, you know?
Yeah. Totally. That's so right. And it's like you're about to go into the biggest group project you've ever been in. You don't know it.
So
It's
true.
yeah, and like all parents have this reaction like, oh, you got no idea what you're going through. But of course it's also wonderful. And it's like, I don't want to make it so negative for those that are maybe prospective parents, but like I think, it is true. It's like you don't know until you actually get there for so much of the stuff, but it also has to be that's a big thing that comes up in the dad groups is how do I get on the same page with my partner? And I talked to Dr. Daniel Singley in California a lot, a good amount of times. And when we talk, and he shared like, how he talks about, the weekly meetings that also I recommend for everybody. And there's a logistics meeting, and then there's like the like what's coming up for us meeting. It's just they're
Hmm.
separate meetings, and having those. And honestly, it's like it's easy to skip, and I'll speak from experience. It's easy to skip those and think like, oh, it'll be fine, and then then it catches up to you inevitably. It's like if you didn't do the logistics with them, then one partner ends up shouldering it, and then they're harboring, and then it comes into the emotional meeting, and it
But
shows up anyway.
yeah, and I mean, I think there's a maybe cultural tendency for like women to pull some invisible labor that men don't see. And the more that we can sit down and like really talk about what's getting done and what needs to be done and what's happening and just communicate and like keep those lines open, then the more we can really see what is each person dealing with, what needs to happen,
Yeah, you
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 know?
were bringing this up or indirectly like this other way. It's like where on one hand, absolutely, there's cultural expectations. I think in our world, like that's a pretty well-known thing now. This labor that's being done by mostly women here that like the other partner doesn't see, and that is true. And we're
Hmm.
holding that to be usually true, and of course, every couple is different,
Of
but
course.
we also mentioned like the gatekeeping that happens as well, and it happens for men and women, and both other parents are in a way they have a preference for how things are done, and when they do
Uh-huh.
that, it causes a lot of challenge, and it interacts with also larger systems, so that like we can kind of what I'll bring up is like some of this is the expectations that we're allowing in on ourselves, and for good reason. Especially a lot of women will feel all this pressure from their peers and from social media, etc., and be like, okay, like, I have to be this level of parent. I need to get it to this level. My partner doesn't agree. They don't see it that way. They don't feel that pressure. They don't, whatever it is. And,
Mhm.
it's such an important conversation to continue to have because, again, coming up with this idea of minimum, sort of following that minimum standard of care, it's like we both want to have a birthday party, and your expectation of a birthday party looks like this, and mine looks like this, and then the labor obviously is quite different for
Yes.
that. And if I don't agree with that kind of a party, then you can do labor with it. That's something you want to do. That's what you want to do. But that's still getting done alongside all the other parenting things. And it ends up, again, bringing up resentment and all the challenges that come back there. So it's like, okay, how do we agree? And again, it's like it becomes like a values process and dealing with like the wider society and like having both empathy for example, I have empathy for my partner that she's experiencing that, but then also be like, you have to push back on that. Like, you don't have to do it. We don't have to meet this standard. That is bullshit for us. Sorry.
You're fine.
uh, so that's bullshit for us, and it's like,
Yeah.
okay, like we have to have a different standard, and that takes a lot of confidence too. But that's a confidence that you guys can have together, like facing the world. And the more you're aligned, and I believe that is also true, by the way, with your kids. Like, you can look at a problem together and
Mhm.
solve it when you're, having a child that's old enough to communicate like that with. But also, it's true for your partner. Definitely, it's like, okay, how do we, not me against the world, because that feels a little, too much. But like, definitely, like, we have to be okay with how we're going to approach this with the grandparents, with the, our friends, our peers, and they may not agree with us. I mean, we have to hold, that. So just thinking about how that might ends up turns into gatekeeping of it, and then the load of work and how they all connect to me.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I see very skewed side of gatekeeping, to be very honest. I feel like I see some ba really balanced things with gatekeeping. I see a lot of moms. I'm just going to do it because my husband isn't going to do it the way I want to do it, or it's going to take longer. I'm going to have to redo it kind of gatekeeping.
Mhm.
And I see a lot of the disagreement and tension usually around, are we sleep training? Are we bed
Mhm.
sharing?
Mhm.
Are we continuing to breastfeed? As big hot button topics where parents don't always land on the same page, and we can have some real struggles with how that actually executes when
Yeah.
it comes to like, are we sleep training or not? And they're like, fine, we're not, but then sleep's yours. And it's like, that's not a fair fallout of like that, we're not going to sleep train, so I'm not going to do anything helpful when it comes to sleep. Or
Yeah.
and so those are things that I tend to see a lot in my work where those things tend to break down. I mean, obviously because folks are coming to me for that developmental and attachment view on sleep. So they're coming to
Right.
me for a specific type of sleep support. And most of the families I work with, both parents are on board. Sometimes it not 100% matched up with what they look like, but usually their values on board, but not always. I do get a good number
Yeah.
of families where they're not value aligned, and it's hard. I mean, it's hard for me as a coach to
Ye-
navigate because I'm a
Yeah.
therapist, but they also really need help. But it's hard for them, and I feel for them trying to grapple with that big difference in
Yeah.
parenting
I
values.
it's a belief about how important this is. So, like,
Yeah,
all I can think of when you were saying that, a parent might say, suffering for what? What are we doing this for? Because we're
yeah,
suffering, and they may be, really well intentioned. It's like, I need my sleep. I need to get to work. If I don't get to work, we don't do well at work, then we're gonna
hmm
have, and it's a valid point. Or we haven't had any time together, intimacy.
hmm
We haven't had any space together. I can't experience you in the way that I used to.
hmm
I've forgotten all these feelings, and they're all real. And it's like, so I always talk about these three relationships, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, but just, that obviously there's a relationship that each parent has to the child, but then there's a relationship between each other. we have
Mm-hmm.
to spend an equal or give an equal amount to. And then there's a relationship to ourselves. And of course, that includes our friendships to maintain ourselves. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, if at any point we're probably not balanced, in the three, but
Mm-hmm.
we really need that balance between the three. And the more we can, on one hand, support, and each one of these arguments needs to be made and talked through, because I find that the protest, as we would say in therapy, right? The protest is, the message is, hey, I'm here still. I miss you.
Mm-hmm.
That's the partner saying to each other, or I miss myself. I don't even know who I am anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I'm someone else. And both partners can feel this and still feel that the other person doesn't see that. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like, it's quite lonely. And again, a lot of this, and I steal this from it's not really just about parenting, but it was a parenting podcast. Ezra Klein, I'm a big fan of this. Like, when he does stuff on parenting, it's great. He brought this guest in. I'm forgetting her name, but she talks about the problems of isolation, the problems of community. It's like, ultimately, like, if we welcome more people into our circle, which is a cost to that, and there are many different costs, but it also supports us to be able to make some of these decisions with less rigidity and consequence. Because I think, like, if I'm a dad and I'm like, I really need my sleep, the babies, I can't sleep when they're in the room, or breastfeeding is, making you go crazy and doing you treat me poorly because of that. Understand it, like, everybody's just at wit's end. If they could just go into their own room, if they could just take a bottle in a, not just pumping, but like, sort of
Mm-hmm.
another way of eating. So feeding. So just thinking, how, if I don't really believe there's an impact of the importance of the attachment view on this, and and I know how you're viewing it, then I'm gonna say that the suffering is not necessary, and then I'm gonna, my way of fighting back in the protest is to say, you take care of it.
Yep.
And it's like, and then of course what's happening is the relationship is deteriorating
Yep.
rapidly, in
Yes.
that kind of situation. So it's really hard. It's nonstop, and that's why I feel for all of us in this sort of culture that's like emphasizes sort of like many times just two people taking care of a baby, when maybe historically this was much more. It was a community,
Yep.
and well, community was also very connected in many ways that supported the different response.
Yeah, and I mean, not just more community, but I think that expectation of like our relationship should very quickly look like it did
Mm,
before
mm,
baby. Like that is an expectation that is cultural also,
yeah, you're
right?
right.
As
Mhm.
opposed to respecting like, okay, if you gave birth and you're nursing and, hormones in the first 6 months, a year of nursing
Totally.
are all over the place. So, like your relationship doesn't have to be pre-children right away. This is a phase. It's not the rest of your relationship life with this person. And I think we have trouble sometimes grasping that like what we need to connect right now might look different than it did a year ago. And it will look different in a year. And we need to find what that is that works for us now instead of being like, it's not like it was, therefore everything is terrible. You
Yeah, I
know?
mean, what you're saying, first of all, thank you for saying it the way you said it. It's like, this is grief, and it's just a lot. It's a
Hmm.
lot of grief around this, and it's not going to be like it was. Absolutely right. Um, we're not going to be like we were individually too. Like, there's just so much that
Exactly.
changes all at once, and it really is a cultural thing, like you said. It is a lack of a cultural recognition that this is the biggest thing that will happen to you in your life outside of you dying.
Hmm.
It is the biggest thing. And we can say, oh, yeah, that's a big deal. It is a big deal. We recognize people having kids. No, not really. We recognize maybe the birth, but the process and all the other stuff, it's not. There is a process of both self-isolation, and that's why I come back to the community piece, because
Yeah.
it is not normative, like you're saying. It's not culture recognized, but there's not someone saying, hey, this is about to, not only is it about to change, but it's the one thing to tell someone, but it's another thing to be there with them and coach them and be supportive of them through this process. It is really, really hard to go through, and it doesn't end, it changes. And of course, I don't want to. I mean, I would hope that someone doesn't feel dissuaded to have children just by listening to us. I was thinking it was can sound pretty hard, but it is both hard and a
Wonderful.
recognition that it's I wouldn't have it any other way personally. Obviously, I mean, this is my work, but also I love being a dad, but it's like it's so beyond the self.
Yeah.
It is actually a communal act to have a child. And it just feels like it's a family act, which is so weird to think of it that way. I think it's so hard even to see our own culture as we're talking. I think Kim is like definitely apparent to me.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting to me, right? Because I think one of the things that makes it harder is that our cultural narrative gives such narrow answers to these problems.
Mm,
And so a lot of people don't realize, even if you were in your full, I'm sitting here with a good night's sleep, feeling really resourceful, you don't realize that there are other ways to connect
mm,
than right after your baby goes to bed, right? Like that is literally what you're culturally programmed to expect, right?
mm,
And then you throw people into like the first year of parenting where you're not going to get your best sleep,
mm, mm.
right? Frankly, even if you sleep train, you might not still be not be getting your best sleep because it's not a guarantee. Like, doesn't always work, doesn't always
No,
last.
no,
And we don't talk about
exactly.
that enough either, but that's a different conversation.
Yes,
Um,
you're right though.
it's not like this magic solution, like just get through it, like some sort of
That's
parenting
right.
hazing, and then you're on the other
That's right.
side, and
Totally.
you're gonna
Yeah.
have great sleep forever. Like, no, that's not how it works. But like we don't see enough or talk enough about like all the different ways, like okay, you want to go on a date, but you have a baby that really struggles with a babysitter at nighttime, fine. Go on a brunch
Mm,
date.
mm, mm.
Get somebody to watch your baby for like the daytime. Like there's so many ways we just gotta open up our like options a bit.
Yes.
Um, because it gives you so many more ways to find solutions to some
Yeah.
of the problems. And it's like, okay, what's really bothering you here?
Mm-hmm.
Um, is it that you personally aren't the type of person who can get back to sleep after you're woken back up, but your partner can? Like my husband is, when our kids were little, lactation hormones were magic for me. It was very easy for me to fall back asleep, and he just couldn't. So,
Mm.
like, if I needed him at night, he was there, boom. Like, but I did most of the night wakes because we co-slept, I nursed, and it worked for us. Like it was an intentional decision, not, him
Uh-huh.
not doing. And the times when it didn't, all I did is be like, hey, I need you to take this baby and rock them because nursing isn't working. And boom, he did it. It was great. Fine. It worked really well for us. But like, so like, you have these sort of different sleep personalities as adults or different things. And I just totally let him thought where I was going with that. But we
I
have
see.
like
Mhm.
all these different ways that we can think about solving the problem. Like, is the problem that you can't get back to sleep, or is the problem that you feel like it's wrong that baby is sleeping near you still? Or is the problem that you don't feel like you have time to connect? Or is the problem that you're trying to work at night, right? Like all of parents are like, we want time to connect. Okay, get baby in their own room for the first part of the night. And then what do? They work. And I'm like, that's not what you
Mm.
wanted this time to connect, and now you're not connecting. So um that's out of my zone of fixing that problem. But you know what I mean? It's like, what are we trying to achieve? When we go under it a bit, we can find different answers. Um, More answers, I guess. Not always different, but more. Uh, yeah, I get feisty
Um,
about that. I'm like, we got to think creatively. So many ways we can solve some of these points of tension for both parents if we can listen and actually figure out what's behind the concern or the like. I want a sleep chain. Okay, why? Like, just like in a non-confrontational way, like kind of like go deeper into that. Um,
yeah, I just to maybe speed us up to like a later date, you had originally asked me like about like what are the themes also for like the older kids. And I
yeah.
heard you bring that up a little bit. Just thinking about um the more probably the single most the guys will say that is most helpful is understanding that our kids really want to be connected to us. It's like even from a very young age, people talk about the real cries versus the fake cries, like this idea of fake crying. It's like, like that's not a real cry. They just want comfort. And it's like, well, that's actually a need too, and
Mm-hmm.
it's like, how does that look even a few years later when the kid's like, doing everything they can not to go to bed because they don't want to be disconnected. And
Yes.
like that reframing of being connected to your parent and helping them support them through what's a hard disconnection for them when they go to
Hmm.
their own bed is I think really helpful for a lot of fathers because I think otherwise the framework is I need to win the situation because
Mhm.
they're not complying, and if they
Yes.
don't comply, then they won't be good sort of kids, whatever that means. I'm being broad strokes here, but really what that means is that I'm not a good dad, right? I
Yeah.
have to hold the line, which, I'm all, I very much, I mean, my sidekick is is Dr. Becky. She's like, I find her to have the best interventions around this for me personally and our family. I have my own some things that I do differently, but not much. And I think like ultimately this is the point, which is like, what do they? Every behavior has some meaning to it, and that meaning here is I need more connection and
Yeah.
sleep and connection. Even I find it a lot when they wake up too. And this is from a different resource, but idea of collecting their attachment needs and means like okay, like when they come back from school, when they go to bed, when they go to
Hmm.
wake up in the morning, it's like, hey, I'm happy to be here with you. I'm so glad I'm here with you.
Yeah.
And it's that reconnection back to the source, which for them, the source is you.
Yeah.
We all have our own, ways of naming what our source is, but like they they need that from us, and they're asking for it, even when they're telling us they don't want it. Even when they
Excellent.
tell us like, I want it to go away because it's too hard for them, so it's too intense for them, and that's a little more complicated. But I think the bottom line is, framing it that way. I think dads can show up in a different way, and still hold a boundary and say like, okay, like we are going to go to bed here. And I'm going to support you to do that. Um, Sort of at the same time, I understand that this is about the fact that you're wanting connection.
Hmm. I say a lot that connection is like a superpower. It is like the parenting superpower because so much
Mhm,
comes back to it
mhm.
in different ways and in different
Most definitely.
forms, but so much of it is just about connection. Um, so, yeah. Oh, dads. I had a question I was going to ask you, and it just went totally out of my head while I was listening to you talk.
Dads, yes.
Uh, sort of as we wrap up our conversation, are there any other big themes that you see in your work? I feel like we touched on a lot of the ones that come up in my work, but any big themes that come up in your work relating back to sleep that we haven't touched on? Yeah.
Well, I don't like, I think the reason that we talked about your work and because they're the same, some of them are the
Yeah,
same, right? It's like,
absolutely.
thinking about this connection piece like that is a big one that comes up. Like I want to be enough for my kid and hold the line. And I think what I do think we did touch on, I could further go into it is like, it's of watching the other parent, hold a different hold parenting in a different way or do something that they feel like is not aligned, and then the reaction to that, and I think what dads tend to go towards is like I need to be, in some cases it's the rock, in this case it's the strong line that says we're not going to go further than this. And of course there's tons of exceptions to this. I don't want to be
Yep,
sort of naming
absolutely.
this objectifying men and their dads that are doing great work as fathers, but I think that is a big one. And I also think like a big one, another theme is like I didn't have a roadmap here, or the
Hmm.
roadmap I had is not something I want to follow. And that's a fair amount of men too, especially the men that are seeking this work, are usually because they don't have a roadmap, and they would like support in doing that, from peers and also I see myself and others professionals. So it's
Hmm.
like there's a lot of stuff there. It's like I don't a lot of times we will as people, not just the fathers, they'll say like, oh, I'm like they see some of their strategies coming up that they were given or enacted on them when they were kids, oh man, I'm just as bad as the dad that the bad parts of the father that I had. And there's a lot of self-criticism, of course, which is a common strategy that people use to deal with, what comes up for them. And they, it's couldn't be further from the truth. It is true, things will show up from our childhood, but here we are, usually talking about it with them. And it's like, imagine your father didn't go to therapy, or he didn't do this group, or he didn't try to make a change in this. And we're interrupting this. And we have to be self-compassionate. We have to have compassion for ourselves here. And it's like, like this is hard work. Because I always say, like, how many hours have we met? And how many hours have you been alive? How many hours have you, it's like most of your childhood, you had to do what you had to do. And you created a survival strategy, which comes from my training, which I can always tell you a little more about. Talk about, adaptive survival strategies. And that was effective, or at least attempted to be effective when you were a kid. And now this isn't working for you. You don't want to do this. And it's showing up here because you're under great stress. And and now it's in play with your partner's adaptive survival strategies. And she's under great stress, or they're under great stress. And it's like, okay, well, now we're knowing what's happening. So now next step is to kind of like see what's the messages of this. It's like, as one of my dad said so eloquently, do the thing. It's like, I just want my kid to do the thing. Yeah, fair enough. Like, I want them to do the thing too. Like, we all want them to do the thing, but they're this separate person, and that's its own can be very triggering for us. It's like, I never spoke to my parents, so I know I've said that. God knows I have, and I didn't. And where I did, it was a lot less common, that's for sure. And there were a lot of different consequences. And so just thinking like, this is hard to try and do something different here. And in the process, as you do something different and you give your children something different, which is primarily tends to be like a little more voice and agency, well, they're going to use it. And that also can be triggering. It's just this like really challenging process. And so holding that boundary and being supportive of one another is a very hard task in parenting. And, just thinking about those themes as far as it goes with men, and that's how it shows up for them.
I remembered my question I was going to ask you, so I'm
Sure.
going to ask it and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, sure.
So outcome-based focus. I see this a lot when I'm talking with parents, where mom's like, I want my baby to feel safe and I want bedtime to be more peaceful and whatever. And dad's like, much more outcome focused. And obviously, these are generalizations, as you've said, right? I've seen it flipped. I've seen both want to be outcome based. I've seen both parents come to me and be like, I just want a more connected bedtime and a little bit of time to myself in the evening, and much more fluid relational goals. But do you see that a lot in your work? The
Yes.
sort of outcome focus thinking with kids?
Sure. And it tends to be future oriented. Again, I like when we're like thinking about like, okay, I want this result, but why do you want that result? Because if I don't get this result, my kid's going to be a mess. My kid is not going to, and so there's a lot of like future orientation. It's one of the best things that you'll hear. That's quite, people will say like, oh, of course that sounds like everyone says that, but there's a reason everyone says it. It's like, we're thinking about this future orientation. It's like everything will pass. It's like this too shall pass. It's like we all know that like you parented long enough, you're like it actually is developmental, right? It is about a time period in your life that like for you and them, right? That this is like not going to be as detrimental, but it feels very, very important to fight on this hill. And so I think the outcome orientation is if I don't take this, and by the way, that also plays out in the paternal gatekeeping. When you were talking about earlier, it's like, okay, if we don't do this way, the kid will be completely ruined. And it's
if
like,
you don't get the naps exactly like I do the naps, and the whole day is just awful,
yeah,
you'll never have good
exactly.
sleep again.
Let's all just like, okay, like, yeah, you're not going to be perfect. Start there, right? It's not going to be perfect. The parenting, none of this. There is no perfect version. And
Yeah.
at the same time, you can also be compassionate to like, hey, like you haven't slept in a while. You want your own time with your partner. And to me, when we slow this down in therapy, and like it's sort of in the more quieter moments, the intimate moments that we have, it is grief about what can't be and what we
Mm-hmm.
can't control. And so the outcome orientation is definitely coming from this, need to know when is unknowable and to not suffer the pain that already is coming or is present. And then what happens is that pressure on yourself that you put and your partner puts and you put on each other and so on ends up causing the same or more of the suffering that you would have already been experiencing, just differently.
Mm-hmm.
And the more we can be in touch with that, which by the way is very hard to do, and I think is a little harder for men to do, just because we're not as accustomed to it. And I think that's fair. And I'll put myself 100% in that box. And obviously, I've done a lot of work to remove a lot of that. But I just saying like it is really hard to be with. Because if it's not outcome based, what does that mean for us? Does that mean I'm not going to be able to ever have time for myself? That's a real question that comes up. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like, you know what? Maybe not tonight. Maybe not this time, but like let's just. And then what, like you had talked about earlier, cycle goes the other way. It's like, okay, I was present with them. I realized I was having needing to make them feel safe before they went to bed. They went to bed. Then tomorrow they had a little easier time, and the next day a little easier. And it plays the other way versus the
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to hold on to this tightly, and the kid still doesn't feel safe, and then they react, and it plays out in a different enactment. And so we're just really um, trying to demystify what's happening and sort of support our uh, parents in this way to know, like, it's not forever and there is some grief here.
I love that. It's so true.
Mm.
So true. Especially, gosh, just thinking of it in terms of some of these really, really highly sensitive babies and toddlers that I end up supporting, where their whole parenting experience is gonna be harder, different, more challenging. Like these are just more sensitively wired kiddos. And for a lot of them,
Mhm.
that's not going to just be sleep in the early years. Like it is going to be,
Mhm.
some parents have harder parenting paths than others. Everyone has hard stuff, but like some kids just
Mhm.
require extra, and that is just the facts.
So right.
And it is a grieving process and accepting because those are also
Mhm.
beautiful, wonderful children. Um,
Right.
and so kind of coming to that place of acceptance.
Yeah,
Um,
I think Dr. Beatty calls these, and
Deeply
I'm not,
feeling kids.
yeah, deeply
Yeah.
feeling kids, right? I like that terminology. Feels
It's a
like
good
it's,
one. Yeah.
yeah.
I remember the first time I heard it, and I was like, that's pretty good. It's pretty good.
Mhm.
Nice.
Mhm.
Nice.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
I like what I've seen of her work. I haven't dove super, super, super deep because I already
Mhm.
had my people by the time she kind of came
Fair
on the
enough.
stage, and I was like, I
Fair
already
enough.
know what I need to know. But I do. I think that is a really good term for those kiddos.
Mhm. All right.
Adam, would tell
Yes.
folks where they can find you, and I will link this stuff in the show notes as well. Where can they find your groups, your website,
Sure. So if
socials?
you Google Dads with Wisdom, so dads, www.dadswithwisdom.com. And that's like for the dads. And if you're interested in doing individual work, if you're in DC, Maryland, Virginia, also happy to have you in our Dads 2.0 groups, which are more of the therapy groups. So that's more of like for the local. But like the new dad support groups that you can get that. I've had people from all over join for those. And yeah, and the quick parental loss groups too. Those through adamodulatherapy.com. So that's like my individual therapy stuff.
Awesome. Thank you
All
so
right.
much for this great conversation today.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you for joining me today. I hope this episode left you feeling more informed, confident, and encouraged on your sleep journey. And just a reminder before you go that nothing in this episode is individualized to your specific sleep situation, nor is it to be taken as medical advice. Take what resonates, ignore what doesn't, and check with your healthcare provider about any medical concerns. Take a moment to subscribe to this podcast so that you'll never miss an episode. And take a moment to rate, review, or share an episode you love on social media. All of that helps parents just like you find me, this podcast, and this gentle and responsive sleep information. I'll see you next time.